All right, so it is 10 o'clock, so we will get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexandra, and I work for the City of Sunnyvale, and I will be moderating for today's program. Along with our co-sponsor Bosqua and our instructor Jennifer Ahlstrand, I want to welcome all of you to our class. Thanks for being here today. Yes, we can email you the slides later from Jennifer. Thank you. Great. So before we begin this program, I'd like to provide some guidelines for successful participation for this webinar. First, all attendees are muted by default to reduce the background noise to the presentation. We will be pausing periodically throughout the presentation to allow for questions, and we highly encourage you to ask any questions that you have. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so in two ways. The first option is to type your question into the Q&A chat box. I will then read the questions to the instructor or respond directly to you in the chat. The second option is to use the raise hand option. Then I will call upon you and unmute you to ask your question. This illustration at the bottom shows where you can find the raise hand button and the Q&A button. I'd also like to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on Bosqua's website afterwards. Great, so now I'd like to share a little background on Bosqua's landscape education program. Bosqua is a special district that represents the interests of 26 cities, water districts, and private water companies, all of which purchase wholesale water from the San Francisco Regional Water System. Bosqua member agencies collectively serve over 1.8 million residents and 40,000 businesses in San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Alameda counties. Bosqua's goal is to ensure a reliable supply of high quality water at a fair price for agencies and their customers. Consistent with that goal, Bosqua provides regional water conservation program to support agencies in improving water use efficiency. The landscape education program is one element of that program. So while we have made significant strides in water use efficiency in the past decade, there's still room for improvement. Outdoor water use represents the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation in the Bosqua service area. Outdoor water use reduction through the use of water efficient plants and innovative techniques can help conserve water and ensure that future water supply needs of our communities are met. Here are just a few highlights on additional conservation programs that may be of interest to you. Valley Water has several rain barrel rebate options. You can get up to $35 for installing a rain barrel and $1 per square foot for a rain garden. Bosqua has a newly redesigned landscape program, which provides rebates to customers of participating water agencies for replacing water-intensive lawn space with water-efficient landscaping. There's the Bosqua Lawn Be Gone rebate, which gives residents various rebates for transforming their lawns to making them more water efficient. Bosqua also has the I Heart Greywater program, which gives residents up to $200 in rebates for connecting a washing machine to a greywater irrigation system. Another new addition for Bosqua is the Smart Controller program. This provides instant rebates and heavily discounted pricing on the purchasing of the Ratio 3 irrigation controller. This controller can be operated right from your smartphone and can be purchased for $100 plus tax through this program by customers of participating water agencies. For more information about this and finding out which programs are available in your area, please visit bayareaconservation.org. And all of these links will be in the chat for you for further resource. The City of Sunnyvale also has some water saving rebates to offer you. We offer $1 per square foot of rebates for replacing your lawns and plants that require a lot of water with drought tolerant plants or permeable hardscape. We also offer up to $200 in rebates for properties that connect a clothes washer to a gray water irrigation system. You can learn more about this at sunnyvale.ca.gov/savewater. Furthermore, if you're looking for compost, stop by our city smart station Monday through Sunday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. for compost and mulch. Remember to bring your own shovel and container. Valley Water also supports sustainable landscapes. They have rebates from $1 to $2 per square foot, and you can find more on this at www.watersavings.org. Other resources can be found at southbaygreengardens.org, watersavings.org, and by emailing waterwise@valleywater.org. You can also sign up, excuse me, for Valley Water's e-newsletter to learn more and keep up to date with Santa Clara Valley Water District. If you, excuse me, if you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to stay tuned for our upcoming webinar classes this spring. You can view the full schedule and register at bayareaconservation.org. Finally, if you're looking for additional resources on water efficient landscaping, please visit the bayareagardening.org Waterwise Gardening website. The site supports residents in water efficient landscape renovations and management. Resources include a gallery of gardens with plants identified, plant selection tool, and a watering calculator. To let us jump right into our main program, I'll be happy to take any questions on rebate programs in the Q&A chat box, and all of these resources, again, will be available to you there. Now, I am pleased to introduce our instructor, Jennifer Ahlstrand. Jennifer, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it from here. Thank you.
Great. Hello, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm like, it didn't show up. So, okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Share. Oops. I just did that. I knew I was gonna do that again. Wrong button. Okay, there we go. So hi everybody. I'm Jennifer, and I'm happy to be here with you today. Looks like we have a nice small group, so that should be good for questions and getting a good conversation started. All of those programs looked amazing, so I would definitely look into a lot of those if you're wanting to cut back on your water. So this is a little bit about me. I grew up in the East Bay. I actually went to art school and grew up gardening with my mom, who is a landscape designer. And that was kind of one of my first jobs, was helping her do landscaping while I was in art school. And so it definitely filtered into my interest without me really realizing it. And after art school, I started growing succulents just as a hobby and discovered that it was like all I wanted to do. I became quickly obsessed. And so now I kind of use that as my main medium. I do classes on propagating, landscaping, and I've definitely shifted over the last couple of years more into the wedding scene. So I do, as you can see, a lot of stuff with combining flowers and succulents. But I do grow most of my own supply that I use for all of my projects, because that's my favorite part. So what we're going to go over today is we're going to go over design, planting and soil, watering, light, maintenance, and propagation. Propagation's my actual favorite part, so I'll try to keep that one short because I do entire classes just on propagation because it's so fun and interesting. So I'll go over that a little bit, but we're going to just I'm trying to give you like a big picture succulents for now so that you can start experimenting in your own gardens. Oops. There we go. Okay, so just a little bit about succulents. They're defined only by the water stored in their leaves. So like cacti, So all cacti are succulents, not all succulents are cacti, right? So it's just any plant that stores water in their leaves. And as many of you know, there's a lot of different kinds with different colors and growth habits. And that's why they make such a great plant to use in your gardens, because you can really, if you only did succulents, you would get a huge variety and have a really lovely garden. They want to live. They naturally grow in a really unforgiving climate. So they have found all kinds of ways to propagate. They're different than other plants in that they can produce roots from many different areas on the plant itself, rather than just at the bottom of a stem in a certain conditions. You know, I don't know if any of you have tried propagating plants and succulents, but you might find that a lot of plants take a lot of work to propagate, like hormones and certain conditions, and you know, keeping like a little moisture tray on top. Succulents are not like that. They'll just shoot roots into the air sometimes if you just leave them on a table. So they just want to live. So that's why they're so great for beginning gardeners. And you know, they will forgive you. So another reason why I fell in love with them, because while I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do, I did window display at Macy's for my first job in San Francisco. And I was so busy with that while I was growing the succulents. That was what made me love them so much, is because I could just forget about them for weeks on end and they would look the same. And yeah, so this is why they're great. So don't be scared of them. They're really forgiving. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the design aspect of gardening with succulents, how to make it pleasing to the eye, because I think that that's, you know, that's why we do it, right? It's why we have gardens, for enjoyment. So let's try to make it the most enjoyable we can. The things to consider are balance and variation of color, texture, sizes, and shapes. These elements will create movement, which just means that it's like the way that when you look at something, it's the way your eye moves through the space, or even the way that you physically move through the space, right? So it's that is a really big part of it. So all of these different things are going to affect that. So the probably most obvious thing is colors. A lot of times when I'm designing a garden, that's like kind of the first thing I think about. I'll ask someone what their favorite colors are and think about what things work well together. So as you can see, this is kind of a restrictive color palette. Like the blues and the yellows are really the main focus here. There's something called bridge colors that I find really help make colors blend together well. So for example, you have like this really kind of bright yellow, and then you have kind of this gray blue. By mixing in this grassy color that's a little bit more golden, you can see how it kind of makes those colors bridge together more softly, right? So it kind of breaks it up, kind of connects them, if that makes sense. So that's something great to think about. So you don't have just kind of these big harsh patches of very like bright colors. It will soften things and make it more pleasing to look at. And again, feel free to, like, you can put your questions in the chat. Feel free to like interrupt me, because I want this to be casual and fun. So yeah, anytime you like have questions about what's on the screen or anything I say, just go for it. Okay, so textures and shapes. So you can see, for example, this sedum, this little teeny sedum is fine and soft, and it contrasts really well with like these bigger leafed things like agave. It's going to create good movement. You're going to have like a good mixture of textures that way. You can combine lots of different plants that way. You could do a whole garden of just like one type of texture, but oftentimes with that is I find that things blend together and you don't quite get credit for everything, if that makes sense. So by kind of mixing different textures next to each other, they're each going to show up individually well. Things won't get lost. Okay, so I'll kind of in line with that is movement and grouping. So the way you place your plants is also going to change how things look. So this is an awesome front yard, especially for drought tolerant, I think. It's very modern and there's not a ton of plants, but they look great and they each show up really well by themselves. So the placement of them, I think, works really well because it seems random, which makes it feel really natural. So again, this is like total up to you. So this is all, that's what's great about this is everybody has different tastes. So this I would consider a more organic, natural front yard, where you could also do it like very formal, which would be things that are like in straight lines, repetitive, not so much how things would grow in nature. That's totally fine too. But if you want them to look natural, I recommend trying to do them random, which sometimes can be hard, right? But things to consider when trying to make them look natural would be like staggering things. See how these are kind of like in triangular, odd numbers. They're very like spread out. And I think that really looks great. Looks like your yard just grew that way by itself, right? The use of rocks is really good here too. They become very much a part of the composition. They're similar sizes to the plants. You see the other good thing that I notice about this is that when you use rocks, it's really important to partially bury them. That will make them look really natural too. It'll make them look like they've been there for a long time and that they kind of belong there. So I always recommend kind of like digging a little edge, shoving at least one of the edges in when you place them. Let's see. And then for this other one on the right, you can use rocks as like a top dressing. So that looks good visually for filling in just areas that don't have plants. You don't have to have plants in every single space. It also does help with overhead watering, in that when you water on rocks, it kind of helps the water not splash out, and it kind of falls more evenly into the soil. So that's good for conserving water. It also helps keep in the moisture a little bit longer, and it can help with regulating the temperature of the soil. So I do recommend using rock top dressings when you need to or when you can. I think it's great. Okay, so another thing to consider is the size and height of your plants when you place them. So this one on the left is amazing, like so many great colors, right? And what is awesome is you have different size plants. So you have these bigger agaves, and then you have these littler echeverias clustering together. You have something tall. It's kind of like, it's a broken up a little bit so that you can kind of see each color and each plant on its own, right? Which is great. And then you have this nice big swath of like sandy rock area. And then the one on the right is a great example of using height well. Think about what is behind your plants. So whether it's like your house or a fence, it's really important what the backdrop is, because that's going to change the way your plants look, right? Also, you don't want to plant something really cool that's short behind something that's really tall. You're just not going to see it. So whenever I plan a space, I walk around a lot. I look at like where I'm going to be coming from the most often, where I walk out of a door, where I'm looking when I'm inside. So my mom would always say that the most important thing she would look at was a kitchen window. Like when you're standing in your kitchen doing dishes, like something that's not so enjoyable, or you're sitting in your favorite place in the living room, what do you see when you look outside in your yard? Like frame that, make that your like happiest moment. Focus on that and really just like put all your favorite plants there. I think that's just the best advice. So with that said, looking at all these spots, walking around, just think about how you're going to see things. I think that's really helpful. With this, having this nice dark fence, see how well the shapes of these really pop. You get lots of credit for them, and you got the lower stuff in the front. It's really good design, I think. Okay, so I always like to throw this in here because, and again, this is just my opinion. To me, these things are not so successful. And I think it's important to show the things that are not great as well as are great. So to me, for why I don't think these are great is this, although the plants look really, really healthy, it's a little stripy, right? You got a big stripe of aeonium, big stripe of agave, big stripe of another aeonium. It's just kind of like blocky and not very natural or interesting looking. So if I were redoing this, I would probably, take out some chunks of the aeonium, put in a few other things with a different texture that were bigger and smaller, right? And then for this one, they are using rocks as top dressing, which is great, but in my opinion, it's a little distracting. Like all I see is these stripy, really high contrast rocks. I would choose one kind of rock, um, maybe in a more natural color. This brown looks like kind of like maybe it's even mulch. I can't really tell, but it looks kind of like an artificial brown. It's just not great. Like I want to focus on the plants and not the rocks. Same kind of with this. The scale of the rocks is really important. So to me, these big old rocks seem too big for this space. They're like, again, they're distracting. They don't look like they would naturally be there. I'm just not so into it. I would choose a smaller size. If you need to create some kind of a wall, there's lots of other things you can use for that. So I would just think about those kind of things. Another thing to think about when you're designing is what plants go well with succulents. Really anything that is drought tolerant and is going to have the same kind of watering schedule will work well with succulents, which is great. So you can do these awesome trees. This one's acacia. I like them because they are kind of the same, like a lot of these are from like South Africa or Australia, and they have a same vibe as succulents, right? So they would look they belong together. Another great thing about them is they will add a little bit of shade. So, but without being like a full thick blanket of shade. So you'll get kind of like a filtered light situation happening with whatever you plant underneath, which actually a lot of succulents do prefer. So we'll talk about that a little bit more soon, but that's why I just chose these as good examples, because I like them and they do all that good stuff. Other things that are great are grasses. That's probably the number one thing that I mix with succulents. Again, because they tend to be really drought tolerant, and also because the textures are so great. This like hairy, fine, bigger chunked shape blends well with all the little textures and different colors of like a big smooth leaf or like other sharp leaves, like they break it up well, they go well together. Protea I love using also. They're South African flower, and the flowers last a really long time. Just a note about them, they can't have too phosphorus of soil, so like be careful if you ever fertilize to just make sure that it's not high phosphorus, because it will kill them. And then like shrubs, drought tolerant shrubs, so like our native Arctostaphylos, which is manzanita. There's so many different kinds of manzanita. There's a lot of dwarf manzanitas. So I know a lot of people, when they hear that, they think giant manzanita trees. There's so many different kinds with different leaf shapes and really gorgeous bark. So that's another one that I highly recommend mixing with your succulents. This is a really great shot from the center picture, is from the Ruth Bancroft garden in Walnut Creek. I know I'm a little bit further than you guys, but if anyone has not been there, I highly recommend it. If you love cacti and succulents, it's a wonderful little 1 acre spot that you can do like a self-guided tour, and they have a nursery too. They're awesome. I'll put a link to that later. So some other things to consider that you can put in your garden or when you're designing is creating focal points. Kind of like I was talking about before, if there's like a special spot, you can use other things besides plants. So you could use like a big fountain or a bird bath, or even just like a pot. I've had really cool pots that I've chipped or like broken before, but I love them, and I end up just kind of using them as if they're a plant. Like I put them in the landscape as just another object of interest, and I find that it works really well and looks fun, and then you don't have to throw away a pot that you love. Another thing to think about is like kind of the way the space is used. So like the front yard versus the backyard. backyard tends to be where you hang out, where you spend more time, whereas the front yard tends to be kind of more formal, like kind of your best foot forward situation. So just think about that when you're planting, and like how you are moving through the space, how you use the space, what you want to see when you pull up to your house, what you want other people to see. I feel like the front yard tends to be more formal, and the backyard tends to be like where I have more fun and experiment and play with stuff, and like change things up more often depending on like the time of year or how often I'm back there, Another thing to think about is be safe with spikes. I've seen people place, and I've done it myself too, place really spiky things in high traffic areas, and it is a bad idea. I have kneed into a huge cactus before, carrying something and not paying attention, and I turned and rammed my knee into it, and it hurt for days and days and days. A lot of things with spikes actually have a small amount of toxins in them. So even though it's just like pokes and doesn't actually stick or stay in there, it will just hurt for days. So don't recommend doing that. So be careful, especially if like little ones or dogs, like definitely be careful. Also, don't be afraid to remove things that aren't working. Sometimes, especially for me, I come from an artist background, so I tend to be able to visualize things really well. But when there's a bunch of stuff in the way, it sometimes can be really hard. It clutters your mind. So if there are things that you kind of just know that you don't want around anymore, sometimes it's a good idea to just take things out before you even make a plan. I find that to be really helpful. And then don't be afraid to experiment. The reason, like I said before, why succulents are so great is because they're so forgiving. You can dig them up and move them much more easily than another plant that might be shocked by that. Succulents kind of don't care, like I said, because they want to live. So they might have a little bit of shock or damage, but overall they're probably going to survive. So like you could dig up like a whole giant agave like this and move it, and it'll be good to go. So if you don't like the way something looks, or it doesn't look happy, and healthy, move it. No big deal. Okay, so planting. The way you plant is pretty important. So as far as spacing, you can pretty much put your succulents as close together, if as far apart as you like. They don't mind being crammed. So unlike some plants where they will kind of overgrow each other, or not be happy if they're too close to something else, a lot of succulents don't mind it, and they actually even like it. I do a lot of potted arrangements, and I really cram them in there. And a lot of people think, oh, am I going to have to replant this really, really soon? There's no room. You'd be surprised at how long they stay happy in there. They're used to kind of growing in tight spaces where soil is limited, and they don't mind. I've actually found them to kind of grow better sometimes when they're close to other ones, and look really healthy for a long time, rather than if they're just by themselves. They kind of help regulate each other's soil that way. Like they don't dry out as fast. Yeah, that's great. So just kind of put them where you want. If something is a little more of a shrubby kind of grower, and it say covers your echeveria and it starts to look bad, like it's not getting enough sun, definitely trim that other thing off. But just again, experiment. It's the best way. Probably the most important thing when planting is keep in mind the height that you plant it at. So a good general rule of thumb is whatever height the plant is when you receive it, like in its nursery pot, it's probably the same height of the soil you want to plant it. Now, that's not always true. I get a lot of plants from stores that are planted much too deep. I'm like trying to see if I have an example. So basically where like their leaves are kind of buried in the soil. A lot of times this happens because if someone's mass producing and propagating, they will just take a plant head and shove it in there because they're doing like a lot, and it grows, but it's not ideal. So In that case, when you repot, you're going to take some of that soil off. Make sure you basically just don't want any of your leaves to be buried in the soil because they'll rot, right? So if they're touching the soil, buried in the soil, it's just they're not happy. So make sure you get the soil level like right underneath the leaves, right where they're stem, but also make sure all of the roots are covered. So you don't want like if your soil level is here, you don't want like a big lump of the root sticking out and then the plant. That's no good.
Hey, Jennifer,
Oh,
sorry to interrupt. We have a few questions, if that's
great.
all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome. So one question is, I planted a bunch of aloes that I bought online about 10 days ago, and they all look like they're dying as well as the cuttings I bought. Not sure what's happening.
Okay. The best way, if you want to email me, you can send me photos and then I can try to help and figure out what's happening. I am going to go over a little bit of like signs of distress. So hopefully that will help you. But if you're still not sure, totally email me and I can try to get to the bottom of it. That's disappointing. I'm sorry.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so height, we talked about that, level of the soil. You want to dig a hole, usually no more than double the size of your plant's root ball. Also, succulents will tolerate losing quite a bit of their root ball. I have found this out by experimenting when I really want to design a potted arrangement and I just have to get this one plant in there because it just completes the look, but there's no room for the roots. I have been known to rip off like 75% of the root ball of a succulent, and it sounds super mean, but it doesn't care and it will keep growing. Like 9 times out of 10, that succulent's like, huh, what happened? I don't know, I don't care, and it will just keep growing as long as it has like nice conditions and it's getting the proper light and water, but it's fine. So again, that's why this is so great. Don't worry if some break off, or if you're like want to experiment with dividing and like half of the roots break off when you're dividing a plant. It's okay. That's why these are the best. So, okay, another thing to think about in both the planting aspect and designing is mounding is really great. These are not the best pictures, but this is a garden I did using a lot of like someone's existing plants. So she had this space like against this walkway and retaining wall. So instead of having just this flat area with a big retaining wall behind it, we thought how fun it would be to make these nice gentle mounds, and it's great for drainage and it looks good. So the drainage, this, because there's a slope, gravity is going to kind of tend to go down. So when you're watering, instead of it just like sitting in a flat area, there's much more risk of things rotting in a flat area versus a mounded area. Especially when you're planting things like mixing cacti in with succulents. Cacti like a lot less water than succulents. So it's a great idea. Let's say, for example, if you wanted to put in a barrel cactus, I would definitely create a mound, just even if it's just a slight mound, create a mound for that. So it's sitting on the mound. So when that thing gets water, it goes away. There's no chance that it's in a slight downward slope or a little like pocket, because all the water is going to go there and it's not going to drain as fast and it could rot. So just a little note on that, why mounds are good. And of course I'm like obsessed. I'm like, use rocks. I just think rocks are so great. They just make it look so much more natural and interesting. And then also here's an example of putting a pot into the landscape. So this it has a really great cactus in it, and we were a little worried about it getting too much water. So, and we loved how it looked in this pot. So just put it right in the landscape. That way, when you're watering, you can kind of control how much that gets watered because it's in its own little vessel, right? Okay, so soil, the consistency of your soil is very important also. So this is like a fun little way you can test your soil and how well it drains. If you like really want to get scientific and into it, you can like measure it, and there's ratios online that you can like calculate like how long it takes for your little hole to drain. The best way is really just, soak an area of your ground and just watch it. Like you could do just a little puddle, and it basically should start to go down immediately is the most important thing. If there's any kind of standing water at all, then it doesn't have good enough drainage for succulents, and you'll want to amend it somehow. So the best thing for in ground I find is like sand and lava rock. So this red lava rock tends to be great in the ground. The color blends in more nicely, I think. And then for potted plants, I tend to mix in pumice. Now you can just buy succulent soil also if you're doing things in pots. Generally, they're pretty okay. Because I grow so much in pots, I kind of am snobby about it and like really want it to feel good and have a certain kind of consistency. So my favorite thing to do is buy really good potting soil, and then I just mix in pumice and sand with it so that I can get whatever ratio I want. Now, this is also because I'm growing tons of different things. I've over the years found, this plant likes way better drainage than this plant. So I will make it in a much more coarse mixture so that it's like drying out immediately. So if you got into it, you could make your own, or you're like planting a lot of stuff, you could make your own. I go to my local soil place in Richmond. Obviously, it's probably far for some of you, but they have a really good ultra potting mix. And then I just get the pumice and I mix them together. So the other thing is perlite. I am very opinionated about perlite. That is actually something that you will tend to find a lot in, I don't know if a lot, I would say in bad succulent soil, you'll find a lot of perlite. I actually used to think that it was like styrofoam because it feels exactly like little granules of styrofoam, but it's actually like superheated and popped pumice, which is so cool. So it's great for propagating, but the thing I don't like about it in succulent soil is that it doesn't have any nutrients in it. And although it does keep the soil light and fluffy and drains well, the fact that it doesn't have nutrients, and then the fact that it's so light over time, it actually will float to the top of your pot. So it won't be dispersed throughout the soil well anymore. And it's just kind of like meh. So don't, unless you're doing propagating, I would not bother with perlite. You'll find it a lot in the soil of plants from nurseries, because again, people are mass producing them and propagating them. I usually break off a lot of the soil. If it's really like foamy and light and has perlite in it, when I buy a plant, I break off a lot of that soil and kind of shake it and like loosen it and try to just get rid of most of that soil before I put it in the ground or in a new pot of soil. Okay, so watering. This is very important and tends to be something that people kind of struggle with succulents. They need water. So although they need less water than other plants, they still do need to be watered. So general rule of thumb is to water them once every 1 to 2 weeks in hotter climates. The amount of light and the temperature is really going to affect how often you water them. When they're in pots, you want to make sure that you're watering deep. So you want water to actually drain out the bottom of the pot. That way, you know, all of the roots are actually getting saturated and getting to drink water. A lot of people think that spritzing succulents is a thing. It's not. It's not. The water will not saturate into the root systems, and it might like help kind of keep them alive, but they're not going to thrive unless you fully soak the soil. And then what you want to do is let the soil completely dry out before you water it again. That's the key. Only water when the soil is bone dry. You can stick your finger in, you can stick like a bamboo chopstick down the side of a pot or in the ground. That's a good way to figure it out at first. And then once you figure that out, just kind of keep in a rhythm. You're going to water less in the winter than in the summer because it's not hot, right? So you can go like once a month sometimes with stuff in the ground during the winter, or not at all, depending on where you are. So drip systems are by far the best way to water as far as water conservation. However, if you don't want to spend the money to set that up and you are going to be doing primarily succulents, you could totally get away with just using a sprinkler or a hand wand to water. I find that sometimes it can be a little more time consuming and you'll be more involved, but I do kind of find that to be helpful in that you can really control what's getting what amount of water, right? Like maybe during the summer, you are just you're watering the edges of your landscape a little bit more frequently than the whole thing, because those smaller things with smaller roots, smaller leaves on the edge, they're going to dry out faster. They're a little more delicate. They're going to want more frequent watering than, say, like a big old agave that's like sitting in the center of your garden, right? So it's a good way to kind of have more control. But I do recommend, if you're going to water, I see this way too often, you got to mimic rainfall. So don't use one of those little spray attachments, the water's shooting out really forcefully. The water's just going to like bounce off. You want something that falls gently and soaks deep into the soil. Okay, so here might help a couple of you, or you who are saying you had some issues with plants. So here's just some signs to watch out for. So here's what an overwatered succulent looks like. The leaves are going to get smushy and see-through, and that's actual rot. So rot is probably the most common way to kill succulents. And unfortunately, it's really hard to come back from this. So once that stem, see how this stem is dark, it's rotted. So once that stem is rotted, there's not much you can do, and you'll probably have to throw it away, unfortunately. This is really common for if you're trying to grow a succulent indoors, which is a tricky thing. Typically what happens is they get overwatered, because when you have things indoors, it's not as hot, there's not as much air circulation, so the soil is going to take way longer to dry out than if it's outside. So if you're gonna mess around with doing succulents indoors, you got to really, really be cognizant about waiting long periods of time in between watering. Okay, so let's talk about light. Like I was saying, a lot of succulents do prefer some filtered sunlight. So this is a picture of my nursery in Lafayette, where there are trees around the perimeter, but overhead it's just kind of, blasting all day sun. And so I have put up some of the shade cloth that's like a 30% shade, just to give a little bit of a break for my plants. So succulents do differ with their needs. So like here, there's a lot of haworthias and aloe, which do prefer a little bit more break from the sun. A lot of succulents can tolerate all day sun. They will just need some more watering, right? So all of these things like the sun and heat will affect how often you need to water them and how stressed out they get. So that's just something to watch. You can kind of train them to tolerate all day sun. You're just going to have to keep up with watering maybe a little bit more often so that they don't get too crispy and stressed out. You can also use other plants as a source of shade. So like, let's say if you have like a echeveria, which are those really beautiful kind of rosette shaped succulents. Some types of those could just be in the sun all day long and they don't care. Others might get too stressed out. So you could always tuck one of those, say like next to a rock or next to a other plant that kind of overshadows it, at least, just taking some sun away just for like even a couple of hours a day, that would be enough to not stress it out, right? So play around with where the sun is, and then also keep in mind that the sun changes throughout the year. So I actually have I have like a really skinny little yard that's like between two houses. And during the winter, man, when that sun changes from being up like this to going like this, I hardly get any sun in my yard, and it's a challenge. So I have a few things in pots that I end up having to move to more sun, because I've lost some succulents before because they just get too sun deprived, and I've accidentally overwatered them because of that, because the lack of sun, and then I didn't reduce watering enough and they just crapped out. So just something to keep in mind. So like when you're planting your yard and planning it, just plan where that sun's going to change and make sure you don't have like, you know, a fence that's going to block all of the sun in the winter, and then all of those plants are going to die or, you know, not be happy. Here are plants that have been sunburned. So the splotches on there, that's actual sunburn. That's not going to go away. Those leaves are permanently damaged, but that doesn't mean the plant's going to die. It'll just keep growing, right? And those will eventually, you can pull them off. But it's just good to know. This usually happens when you transition a plant too quickly from the shade to the sun. Typically, this happens the most when you have a plant inside and then you put it outside. It's just too harsh. So I mean, it's a living thing. Think of it like people. You can sunburn, right? If you're you're indoors all winter, and then all of a sudden you spend all day outside, you're gonna burn. But if you slowly, like and incrementally, go out in the sun more and more often, then your body's going to adjust. Same thing with plants. You have to do it slowly. So, you know, like that's like every couple of days, maybe you inch it a little closer to the sun, or put it like under an overhang, and just do it slowly. Okay, so here's another thing that plants will tell you. So this is a plant that is getting the same plant. This is what the same plant that's getting more sun. You can see it has great, beautiful colored leaves. It's not actually dying. It just changes the way it looks. So it's perfectly happy. That's great. You can grow it in this much sun, or this is in a lot less sun. You can see it's mostly blue. You can even see a lot of this new growth is like kind of green, which is fine. You can if it's too little sun and you have too much of this pale green and the leaves are getting long and skinny, that's probably bad. Right now it still looks healthy. The leaves are nice and plump, they're tight together. It's not too little shade. So these are both just to show you the variations of what's happening, and so how just to learn how to talk to them, learn how to like get the visual cues of what's happening. So they're both great. But this is an example of way too little sun. So what happens when it stretches out like this? This is called exfoliation. So again, this tends to always happen when people are growing succulents indoors that really just don't want to be inside. They're just not getting enough light. So what this plant is actually doing is it's literally like stretching out and trying to increase its surface area so that it can receive more sun. And this is not a healthy plant. So, right, this is an echeveria, one that should be short and tight, and the leaves should all be nice and close together and look like a rose, and it's sad. This you can actually fix, quote unquote, fix. You could behead it, which is a propagation technique. You could like cut it maybe here or down here and give it a little more sun slowly, again, because those delicate little leaves will burn. And you'll actually be able to plant that top piece, and more babies will grow from that bottom cutoff piece. So all hope is not lost when you have exfoliation, but definitely something to look out for. And then I just did a little list of a few succulents here that do tend to do okay inside. But again, like over time, they may even get exfoliated also. But if you want things inside, those are good ones. Okay, so let's go over pests quickly. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're okay. I want to leave time at the end for questions, but there are so many pests. These are just two. I didn't want to like go down a whole rabbit hole of them. These are the two that I find most commonly, so I thought I would include these. This one is root aphid. So it looks like this, like it's kind of like this white, it almost looks like fungus, which there are root funguses too. It could very easily be a fungus. But I find these to be more of a problem, which is why I want to teach you about it, is that if you look closely at this little cottony looking sections, there are little teeny aphid looking things in there, and they actually chew on the roots, and they're such a jerk. And they're hard to see because they're underground, right? So they typically occur most commonly in pots because, you know, things struggle a little bit more in pots. And I don't like to use like toxic stuff for my plants, for me or my plants. So I do find that hydrogen peroxide works kind of the best for this. There's other stuff called, oh gosh, I always pronounce it wrong. Diacro, dia something. Email me if you need to know. Diamicraceous earth, which is like soil that has certain stuff in it that can help that. So that's probably what you want to use if you have like a big area. But otherwise, you can just mix a teeny bit of hydrogen peroxide in your watering can and just water with it. And it's actually great for the roots, great for the soil, and it will fry those little bugs. The most common one I ever see is mealybug. It also looks like cotton. And sometimes, see these little flakes? Sometimes succulents will have kind of this like this sheath, this white kind of skin on it that sometimes just does this in the center, and it can trick you and make you think that you have a mealybug. So look closely, but you will actually see these little guys like crawling around, and they do create like pockets similar to the root aphid. And they tend to hang out at like the joints of the leaves and kind of in between the leaves where they're hidden and protected. I use rubbing alcohol for that. I do a mixture of like probably like 60% alcohol, 40% water, shake it up in a spray bottle and just spray. Make sure you're like spreading the leaves and really getting it down in there. And do it, like watch it for like a good few weeks, because if you miss just a couple of bugs, they're just going to kind of keep going. So that's a good way to deal with it. Remove it from other plants. Same goes with any pest you find. Immediately remove it from your other plants so it doesn't spread. If it's a really bad infestation, a lot of times I just throw the plant away. It's awful and it's sad, but it's really not worth it spreading to other plants, and then you just have like a whole huge headache. So yeah, those are the two big ones. These are some other ones: aphid, fungus, and scale. Aphids are pretty prevalent these days. I find that the more that plants struggle, the more susceptible they are to pests of any kind. So just keep that in mind too. So a healthy plant is gonna be less likely to get bug or fungus problems. Okay, pruning and fertilizing. So again, this fertilizing thing, it's a whole rabbit hole. I could spend like a whole day on that too. So this is just kind of a basic rundown. There's a lot of different schools of thought about this. There's a really popular fertilizer I think it's called cactus juice, that people rave about. I have not used it, but give it a try. And the most important thing that I have been taught is the NPK ratio, which are those numbers that you see here, right here. You want to always kind of look at that when you're buying a fertilizer. This is kind of a high number. You could like 666 would also be good, just something lower. But the most important thing is that they're all evenly matched. You want kind of all the same amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But again, like that cactus juice I've looked at, and it has like lower nitrogen, and it's not all the same. So, but people love it. So there's lots of things you can do. Typically, you really don't need to fertilize succulents in the ground, because when things are in the ground, they have their own biodiversity. You've got worms, you've got insects, you have things decomposing. It's just typically is self-sustaining. Whereas when you have things in pots, every time you water something in a pot, it's draining and washing away nutrients. So I really only fertilize things in pots, and I don't do it religiously. Kind of just when I know a lot of what I have is really pot bound. Things have been in the same pot for years and years, and they have not gotten any new soil or new nutrients, and then I'll fertilize them. A lot of times if I have a pot in a small pot, it's time to repot it in a bigger pot. I just put it in a bigger pot. It's getting fresh soil with fresh nutrients, and I don't fertilize it, right? Because it's getting more nutrients with new fresh soil. So just something to think about. Everybody's different. Some people swear by it and do it every spring. throughout the summer. So it's up to you, but that's just kind of a little basic rundown of fertilization. But so for pruning, again, pretty forgiving. See how this thing is like super overgrown. There are a bunch of dry leaves in here. That's fine. Pull off dried leaves. I always pull off dried leaves. Number one, it's ugly. And number two, it can hide pests. So you don't want to keep them around. And then a third reason that I like to get rid of them, you know, kind of as soon as I see them, is it's a really good way to keep track of the health of your plant. So if you have ugly, dried, crispy leaves and you leave them there and a month goes by and you're watering and you're like, oh, look at all those leaves. Are those new dried leaves or are those dried leaves from 2 months ago when I first noticed them? And it's much harder to keep track of what's currently happening. I have killed plants because of that, because I think, oh my God, that plant's so dry. I look at all those dried leaves and I water it more and more and more. And then it's dead because it's rotted because I didn't remove those leaves, right? Does that make sense? Like it just helps you not get confused as to what's currently happening with your plant. Plus it just looks better. So get rid of dead leaves, trim things that are overgrowing each other. If it's in a pot like this, or like even if this was in the ground, maybe you want to like remove this paddle plant or remove this one big plant in the front or in the center and then backfill it with soil so that the other plants have more room to get bigger and get more light. And you could just move that plant somewhere else, right? So again, just move stuff around. Yeah, let's see, did I skip? Okay, good. Okay, so the last thing I will talk about is propagation. Because it's really fun. I recommend experimenting with this. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, as you can see, and there's more than this. These are just like the basics. So cuttings, that's the easiest, fastest, most rewarding way. I love it. You can't do it to every plant, but any plant that kind of has a stem that you can cut off, like a completed portion of the plant, is how you can do cutting. So like this is both beheading and a cutting. So like that, something shrubby, leafy with lots of stems, trim, trim, trim. This one's called beheading because you literally cut the head off. So that's like what I was talking about when something's exfoliated and stretched out, you could behead it. And then you have 2 more plants. This one is pups and seedlings. So this one's a little bit more rare, where some succulents will grow little plantlets on the edges of their leaves. And it's so cool. And they will actually drop into the soil and then just grow new plants. And you don't have to even do anything. You can pull them off and do it yourself if you want, but I just let them do their thing, fall, and then you can divide it. This Echeveria too is a good example of, it has little pups, little babies all along the collar underneath of the main plant. And these you can pull off gently. You can cut them off or pull them off. Sometimes they'll have little roots attached. Sometimes they won't. It's best when you're doing this method to make sure you have kind of a substantial plant growing before you take it off, because it's kind of never going to grow as good as it does when it's attached to the mom, right? Because it's like they're all sharing nutrients, it's all growing together. So I usually wait. I would wait till they're this size. Like this size is good. I could pluck them off. It's a nice, healthy, fully formed plant already. Chances of survival are much higher than if it was like this little teeny flimsy thing, right? Then leaf propagation is super popular. It's very fun. It will take a long time. I mean, long is relative. For me, it's like I don't have to, I do it just because it's fun, and I have a lot of leaves left over when I do like succulent bouquets, because I have to take some of them off, right? So I have like big piles. I kind of just throw them on a pile of soil and try to water them from time to time and keep them more in a shady area so that they don't fry, because right, they don't have like active roots and stuff. That kind of goes for all propagating. I keep them in a little bit more of a shady area so they're not struggling as much, since they're like delicate little babies just trying to start living on their own. So that's a good tip. Anyway, this takes, depending on the time of year, it can take like months before you get a good sized plant on that leaf. And then the other most common way, whoops, there we go, is dividing. That's super easy. Again, not all plants will do that, but if you have a plant that has multiple kind of cluster heads together, you can divide it by the roots, just rip it apart, gently. You can gently untangle a little bit, but you can also be pretty brutal and just rip them apart. And then you have your each individual plant that has its own root system. It's like probably the most instant gratifying way to propagate. Is that all? Oh, here we go. So this is just some resources. This is the Ruth Bancroft nursery I was talking about that I am in love with. Also, this one's in the valley. It's called Poots Cactus. It's a family little nursery. They've been around for a very long time. It's in Ripon, California, and they're just keep expanding. It's really great. If you are some reason in that area, check them out, support them. And then also here's like a hardiness map. That's also really helpful if you're not sure what plants grow where well. You can check that out, see what your zone is. You can also just like Google plant hardiness zones. And then the World of Succulents is a great website for identifying and finding out like the basic info for each type of succulent. I use that for reference a lot just because there's so many different types and different hybrids happening and stuff like that. So that is a really good reference if you're wanting to find out what something is. Let's see. It's kind of delayed. There we go. Yeah, so that's kind of it. This is like me. This is how to get in touch with me. You can email me, follow me on Instagram. I do, I post my wedding stuff, but I also try to do like little propagation videos and videos around my nursery and stuff like that. And feel free to like reach out with questions whenever you want, and I'll do my best to help. But that's kind of the basic rundown. Hopefully that was not too much stuff, but does anyone have questions for me?
Awesome. Thanks for that informational, fun presentation, Jennifer. That was great. Yes, so we have a few questions here. So one is, aren't cuttings leaves directly on soil? Will they not wilt and die? If leaves on soil that are intended for propagation begin to wilt or discolor, have they gone bad?
Oh, good question. Yes. Okay, so each leaf has moisture in it. So typically that's how it's able to create its own little pup from the leaf. So if you lay it on soil, I tend to use a shallow tray of soil. I will often mix that perlite I was talking about, either perlite or pumice, something with the soil so that it's well draining soil. And I just lay them on top, and I will either spritz them with water. This is like the only time when spritzing is a thing. Spritz them with water every couple of days so that you're just kind of getting that top layer of soil, and it's encouraging them. It's like, it's letting them know like, hey, there is some moisture here. You can try to grow. I have a big nursery where I don't really have time for a spray bottle. So what I'll do is when I'm watering my other stuff, I just kind of give it like a quick, like little sprinkle of water. And sometimes they'll shrivel a little bit, but they'll still be able to grow. If it turns like dark and either crispy or mushy, chances are it didn't make it. I find probably only like 50, maybe 50 to 75% of the leaf propagations work. So you're gonna like be prepared to lose like half of them. That's normal. It's just kind of the name of the game. So it is a trickier one. Another tip for that is when you take your leaf for propagating, make sure that the entire leaf stays intact when you pull it from the stem. So you don't want any cuts or anything in it. You want it to be like a perfectly intact plant. It's even good if some of the stem rips off with the leaf. That's even better. And not all succulents you can leaf propagate. But the best way to kind of determine if it's possible is if the leaf snaps off easily, that's a good indication that it's something you can propagate by a leaf, right? So like certain, like an aloe, like you couldn't do a leaf propagation from an aloe because that they're just, the leaves are like really thin and weird at the end. So yeah, again, experiment, but that's kind of my leaf propagating tips. So did that answer your question? Hopefully.
Yeah, that was a great description. Thank you for that. Very cool. I'm learning so much. I love
Oh,
it.
good.
Great. So we have a few more questions coming in. So the next question is, how do you layer the soil for succulents, soil versus gravel on top, etc.? How deep should each layer be, and how to place smaller succulents in each layering?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so yeah, so typically you do want you typically don't want layers. You typically want whatever your soil mixture is to be very well mixed. So you want it homogenized. You want it to be all um the same mixture. The only time that that's not true is when, let's say you're doing, okay, this is maybe, I don't know, it's just going too far another way, but the only time I layer anything is when I pot things in a pot with no drainage. Now, this is risky, but if you have to do it, which I totally get, because I've like found really cool, weird pots that you just can't drill a hole in, that you would layer charcoal and then rocks and then your succulent soil mixture. And that's going to help any residual water that sits at the bottom to kind of get like filtered by that charcoal. So really that's the only time that there's any kind of layering. And then I guess also too, if you put like top dressing, so like those little tiny rocks I was talking about, if you want to do that for like a decorative element or for like stabilizing something that's kind of tippy is another reason to use that, but that is going to just be on the very top layer. So does that answer the question? I think you mentioned something about depth too. Shallow pots are definitely great for when you're propagating and just starting something, but the depth of a pot is just going to depend on like the root size of your plant and also kind of like certain types of plants. Like there are certain types of plants that have very fine root systems and they tend to not grow deep anyway, and you can get away with using like a really cool shallow pot for that long term. But typically you're just kind of go pot size based on the root size. Does that make sense?
That's really cool. Yeah, thank you for that. Awesome. Great. So the next question is, how long do you find it takes for stems to propagate?
Good question. It's going to differ depending on the plant and depending on the time of year. The best time to propagate I find is in spring, just because it's like not crazy hot, so it's not as like harsh conditions, but it is warm out. Most succulents, their growing season is when it's warm out. There's a few types, however, that the winter is actually their growing season, which like still boggles my mind, but it just depends on where they're native to. So like Sempervivum and what's the other one? Oh, and Aeoniums actually, their growing season is during the winter. So those you could propagate during the winter. I have propagated them during the summer too. Any old time is fine for those. But the best is when it's warm out, because that's when they're just like okay, it's warm, we're going, like let's go fast. And in that case, I will see roots like within days. I will have like big root systems able to be transplanted sometimes within like a month. And it's fantastic because like that's what I'm saying. Like it's very instantly gratifying. It's like, so do it. Now's the time. Now is a great time. But you could do it all summer. If it's warm in the fall, do it in the fall too. I have done it in the winter. You just have to be, again, like just way more careful of not overwatering it and maybe putting it in a sunnier spot because that the warmth will increase the growth. But yeah, it depends on, all the plants are different. You know, some plants are slower growing anyway, so their roots are going to appear slower. Other plants are just like ready to go and gonna pump them out immediately. So just experiment. You can always like pull them out and look and then put them back in too if you're like curious what it's doing. You won't
Yeah.
hurt it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've actually always wondered that as well. Like with propagating, I've tried it a few times. So that was a great question. Thank you for
Yeah.
answering that.
Yeah, no problem. It's the funnest part.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it is. Great. So the next question says, do you cut off flower spikes from succulents? When you do cut a flower spike off, and where do you make the cut?
Ooh,
Oh, when
very
do you
good.
cut it off?
Yeah, good question. Enjoy it for as long as it looks pretty, and once it gets all dry and crispy, then it's time to cut off because nothing else is going to happen. And I try to cut off as close to the base of the plant as possible. And you cannot actually propagate flowers, unfortunately. They just don't have the same like biological makeup as the rest of the plant. So I have tried it before and like gotten some roots to happen, but in the end, you're not going to get a healthy plant out of it. But yeah, just when they're crispy, cut them low, as low as you can to the base so you don't see any ugly stem, and just throw them away.
Cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. Great. So I think these next two questions are from the same person, kind of in the same realm of expertise, but they say, what do you do when your succulents get leggy or long or droopy? Do you cut them off, and where do you make the cut? And then also, do you cut off a flower spike when the blossoms are dry?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I just answered that one. Yes. When the blossoms are dry, cut them. Um, but let's see. What was the other thing? When they get leggy? Yeah. Okay. So you can cut them when they're leggy kind of wherever. Here, I could go back to that slide. Hold on. I'm like doing weird things. Get out of here. You can, short answer is cut them wherever you want. Depends on, okay, here we go. So like with this, you could cut it, if it were me, I would probably cut it up here. Can people see my mouse? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay, good. Right around here. And then I would actually probably remove like this leaf and this leaf. So you have a nice size stem, usually about like 1.5 or 2 inches or so, and then stick that. Then you could do two things. I would cut this remaining piece down lower so that when those little babies grow, they're like in a shorter plant. It's going to look more how it's supposed to be. You could save that chunk of stem in the center too and try to grow that if you wanted. You could stick that in the soil and see if it grows little babies on the top. I would probably do that because I'm like want to save every little piece. So yeah, so you don't like, you could cut it just straight up right here and have this really long stem and stick that, but like this is basically the stem doesn't need to be that long. You really only need like 1 inch of a stem. Because again, you're probably planting it in a shallow tray. So you want a little stem, just enough to kind of hold it up, depending on the plant. Now, there are some kalanchoes that I have that are like they're like tall, lots of leaves. They root like crazy, like it's their job. Those I have been known to like if I have like a huge swath of them, I'll just like cut a bunch, like a bundle, and I'll just strip the stems and have stems like this long, and I will plant them directly into a big old pot of very well draining soil, like a very coarse mixture, so that it dries faster. And then that way when it roots, I just have a plant, a full big old plant in a pot full of roots, because those things root so well. So typically you want little short stems. Depending on the plant and experimenting, you could do big old long stems too. So well, yeah, that's not like too broad, but it depends on the plant. Typically, a little baby stem is fine.
Nice. That's super cool. I like that. Awesome. So our next question is, why burrow tail plants easy drop their leaves when you touch them.
Isn't that amazing? They're so delicate, it drives me crazy. But that is probably just a result of survival. So again, remember when I was saying the more easily a leaf drops from a plant or pulls from a plant, the more easily they propagate. So that is they've literally done that because in the wild, if let's say like a animal like walks by them, brushes against it, every time those little leaves fall off, that's a chance for it to grow new plants. So it's actually a survival technique. So although it's annoying to us because you're like, my plant's falling apart, it's how it's learned to grow. So if you lose those, you save those little teeny ones. They're a little tricky to propagate because they're so tiny, but I've seen it done. So you could sprinkle those on your soil too and spray those and try to get them to propagate. So you just have to be gentle, unfortunately, with those ones. But that's why.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool. I've never heard of that. That's awesome.
Yeah. They're so smart. Like I said, they
Yeah.
just find ways to grow. They're like, oh, okay, you're gonna rub against me? Like, fine, I'll just make babies.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That is smart.
It's so cool.
Yes. Great. So there's another question here that asks how to remove mite web on my succulents.
Oh God, those are the worst. Sorry, I hate them so much. Quarantine it ASAP. Holy crap. They're awful. I have had different luck with different things. So I'm trying to remember what I just did. I had them on my house plants last year. And again, I like to not use anything too harsh. A lot of people use like neem oil and stuff for that. I've heard that it works, but when I have used it, I don't like it because it like coats the leaf with oil and it like kind of doesn't go away and it'll like strip all the good stuff off of the leaves and I just don't like it. So I think what I ended up doing was I used a spray bottle and I put like a little bit of like a natural dishwashing soap, just like literally like a drop or two, and I did rubbing alcohol and apple cider vinegar. And then I mixed that with water. And I can't tell you the ratio because I don't remember. It was like, like little bits of things. And I I put it in the shower, I spray the crap out of it. I like kind of rub the leaves off, like try to remove as much of the mite as possible, like use like a soft sponge. Really be careful at the leaf joints, because they hide in those little crevices, and also like the spines of things. Just any crevices, any little dips is where they hang out, and they can get sticky. So it's like they'll hang on for dear life. So really just, I mean, it was, for me, it was like a good month of taking all my plants into the shower and having like a whole session of cleaning of like, okay, I'm gonna like wash you like a little baby, every little nook and cranny. And then like I would turn the shower on like really harsh and really like just wash all of the stuff off. I would spray them. I would let them sit in there for a few hours with that stuff on them to try to kill everything. And then I'd wash them off really good and try to like see if I could see any, put them back. And then just the key to eradicating any pest is, I think, is you just got to keep checking. Because again, if you miss just 2 or 3 bugs, they'll just repopulate. It did work over time. Most of my plants I was able to save. I think there was like 1 or 2 things that for whatever reason, I just could not get all of them off and I just threw it away. But that's what I would recommend, because like none of those things are super harsh, but they will kill them. So it's more about being diligent. It's more about not what you use. It's about you really making sure they're off, if that makes sense. And like quarantining and washing them down the drain. Wash your hands really well after. Put your clothes in the laundry. Like, I'm not to like freak you out because it sucks, because especially with like COVID germ stuff, I don't want anyone to be like, but it's, if you really want to do a good job, you really kind of have to treat it like a surgery room, like get all the things you were wearing off, wash your hands. I even sometimes like take a shower after, because I'm just like, if any of them are on me, it just kind of stays. So you gotta be diligent. Try not to like freak out. I've like literally cried before from infestations of things where I'm just like, oh my God, I have to throw everything away. Like, You could, or you know, pick your battle, like do your best. If it just won't go away, just say goodbye and start over. That's my therapy session for pests.
I love that. Yeah,
Not fun.
yeah, I'm sure many people have had, including myself, experience with pests, and I've tried neem oil, and I really like how you use more natural products to, that helps the water too and everything. And what you've talked about being really diligent, this might segue into this question by the same person. They asked, I mix vinegar and water, then all my succulents leaves die. So is
Ooh.
there anything about that?
It could have been too much vinegar. I usually just do like a few tablespoons in like a spray bottle, or even maybe even, yeah, like no more than a few tablespoons. So either another thing to do when you're doing that is like, don't make sure they're not in the sun when you're treating them. So sometimes things that like would normally not burn it, like the vinegar or alcohol, if it's diluted enough, it shouldn't burn it. Now, if you sprayed it outside when it was getting direct sun and it stayed on there, then it can burn, because it's like, it'll like exacerbate the acidity. So I don't know if that happened. Maybe that's my guess, is it's either it was treated when it was in bright direct sun, or it was too strong. I'm sorry that happened. That sucks. Just because the leaves are burned doesn't necessarily mean that they'll die. It's kind of like the sunburn thing. Once it's burned, but the plant might not necessarily be dead. So don't give up if that happened. Again, you can send me a picture if you want.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, a person said, thank you for your great information about succulents.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this is amazing.
And a lot of what I've learned, honestly, is like trial and error. So that's why I'm so encouraging, like just like experiment and Google stuff. And I've had things where I'm like, what is happening? What is this? And it's hard to find out. But if you like Google a lot, or just like ask people, most plant people love to share because we nerd out on it. So again, if you have other questions that come in the future, you can like DM me on Instagram or email me, and I'll try my best.
Yay, amazing. Well, does anyone have any last minute questions? The chat box is open, or you can raise your hand and we can get to you. And again, we can email you with all of the webpage links, some contact information, and we can also email you all with the recording after this.
Yeah,
So
and I'll send the slides too. So
great.
Yeah.
Yay. Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that is all the questions. Have a great weekend. Thank you for sharing. Are just some comments coming in. Yay. Yes, thank you so much for this great presentation. It was wonderful and really fun to learn about. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great day, and you will be hearing from us through an email sometime soon.
Great. Cool. Thanks everybody for coming.
Great. Have a great day, and thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.